Welcome to Prose and Cons, a podcast by writers for writers, brought to you by Precipice Fiction. Precipice Fiction would like to acknowledge the people of the Eora and Durag nations as the original custodians and storytellers of the land this podcast was created on.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Prose and Cons, the podcast for emerging writers by emerging writers, where sometimes we feel like prose and sometimes we feel like cons. Joining me today is Alex Eldridge.
Hey guys, my name is Alex. I have contributed to the Precipice anthology with my story Town Hall Steps, and also been published recently in the Big Issues Fiction Edition. Other than that, I write and run a guitar school.
And also Phoenix Reg.
Hello. My name is Phoenix. I'm a prorated editor on Fiverr and founder of Bent Light Writing. So we're an editing house that focuses on authenticity reading and stuff like that. And fun fact, if any listeners are in California or the States or just feel like an international trip, I'll actually be giving a talk at the San Diego conference for the ACES, the Society of Editing. They have a conference in San Diego. I'm giving a talk there early April 4th. So yeah, if you're around, pop by, say hi. I'm going to be talking about authenticity reading and shifting some mentalities there. Should be a lot of fun.
Very cool. Very cool.
Mm-hmm.
And I am your host today, James Healy. I'm a writer and freelance editor on Fiverr. Today, we are going to be talking about structure and different approaches towards structure and different approaches towards storytelling. But before I jump into that, I'd like to ask everyone, what are they currently reading and working on at the moment themselves?
So I've started reading this, listening actually, because a big portion of what I consume in terms of, reading is actually orally with an A. And that is Red Rising, which is a YA series by Pierce Brown. I think it came out back in maybe 2014. Really, really good. It's kind of hangs around it's kind of hits the tropes of the Hunger Games in terms of there's a death game there, there's a different castes of society, that sort of thing. But honestly, it's just done really, really well, and the focus and theming is a little bit different. I just really recommend it. It's one of the very few books that I read the first one and just went straight into okay, let's go right on to the next one. Just because it was very, very gripping and compelling. So if you're into YA or the Hunger Games or Squid Games or anything like that, Red Rising, really, really good shout.
Does that one take place in like Korea?
Squid Games does.
Okay, that's what I'm thinking of.
Red Rising is on a fiction. Well, it's sort of a fictionalized Mars, right? There's like a lower caste of people who are like, oh no, we're getting screwed, and then they send someone to join the upper class and like infiltrate it, and goes from there.
Right. I've been reading Hyperion, which is fantastic. Holy cow. So good. Yeah, I recently put the call out to the group for book recommendations because I'd recently kind of fallen off the book reading horse. Like the books I had just weren't really grabbing me. Every time I picked one up, felt forced, and I was just like, oh, I'm not really enjoying this. So I was just like, I just need a good book. Like, who's got a recommendation? I'll jump in. And it's been so great, so refreshing. On top of that, I just started rewatching The Queen's Gambit because I just started getting really into chess. Turns out I really like chess. It's very fun.
Me too.
Really? Oh.
Yeah, I started playing like online stuff. We should play again.
We should definitely play. I started like a week ago, so I'm still like, my mind's being blown all the time. But
yeah.
I have it's a lot of fun. Oh, far out. Right on.
That's daddy. The book as well goes into all the different like formations that people can build. I don't know if the series must do something similar, but the book goes into like the different like soldier formations you can put together with your chess pieces, and it just makes chess all of a sudden become really lively and interesting.
Which book is this? The Queen's Gambit?
The Queen's Gambit, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't read it.
Yeah. That's a good book, yeah.
I will have to read that.
That's awesome. I've just finished reading, and I'm rereading again, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which is a book about patterns of Japanese culture written in the 1950s.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really, really interesting. And it's kind of trying to I guess they were trying to analyze and understand Japan just after World War II to see how the occupation might work out and to see how like relationships would go in the future, and trying to predict and understand, because it's a very unique culture and very different culture. Absolutely fantastic. And I've been watching a lot of Japanese war films that came out around 1950s, 1960s. So yeah, really interesting. Yeah, combining both of those and trying to learn as much as possible about a very interesting culture.
Yeah. Just a quick note for anyone. I am eating dinner at the same time as recording. You won't hear it, but every now and then you might just see me very awkwardly go off to the side and very clearly take a bite of something. If you're watching.
If there's any loud like ums or murmuring in the background, you know it's Phoenix.
So good.
He's either strongly agreeing with something we said.
I made this. I made this. That's just.
I don't know why, but in my headcanon, you were eating ramen, and I refuse to believe any different.
Yeah, I instantly was like something noodly. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that would be the cabbage salad.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay.
That is an interesting color.
Purple cabbage.
I don't have enough purple in my diet, to be honest.
Yeah, ridiculous. It's great.
Okay, so I guess we'll jump into the topic for today. And I guess everyone knows kind of the importance of structure in writing a story and in kind of plotting something out. Everyone's heard of the 3-act structure, the kind of rising action in the middle, climax at the end, and I'm sure everyone's heard of the hero's journey, which are inciting incident, refusal of the call, mentor moment, leading into, after the midpoint, bad guys close in, all is lost moment, into the 3rd act. And if everyone isn't familiar with that, I'm sure we'll do an episode on that at some point in the near future. So these are really useful tools for structuring and for like building character arcs and keeping a sense of direction and pace within your story. Really useful things to master and things to figure out. But they can also make stories a little bit stale if they're overused, or they can make stories a little bit predictable, potentially. So another thing that's really useful is to figure out how to break up this dynamic a little bit. Once you figured out how to use it well, is there different ways of altering the story or altering the story structure? Something that I particularly like, and I think it's done very, very often in films, it's kind of a non-linear storytelling where you have an event happen and then the story might move to some time before the event and lead into the event, which gives an interesting sense of like direction. How did they get there? How did that happen? And another reason for why that can be used is the release of information. What is the most narratively interesting way of getting the information to the reader? The way of withholding the information until the best possible point. Everyone has probably seen Breaking Bad at this point.
Yeah. Finally, I can say yes.
Oh, excellent. Have you seen past season 4?
I've seen all of it, yeah.
Perfect. So minor spoilers for the end of season 4. But everyone remembers that famous closing shot of season 4 where the camera zooms in on the flower pot in the main character's garden. And what's written on the flower pot reveals information that we already had about a certain type of poison. And it kind of lets everything fall into place that the main character had poisoned someone earlier on at some point in the season and then used this to manipulate another character. But of course, the way that the story plays out is that we see it from the other character's point of view, and we think that this character has made a mistake. I've probably told that story all backwards anyway. But the point I'm getting at is that if the story had played it out chronologically as the events happened, it wouldn't have been anywhere near as interesting, and that final shot into the plant would have had no weight. So the fact that information is withheld, even though it's from the protagonist knew that this happened, it leads for a really great reveal at the close of that season. So that's one reason that kind of non-linear storytelling, or not even non-linear storytelling, but just withholding certain pieces of information until a little bit later on, or adding them in earlier on, can be really engaging. Can either of you think of examples of non-linear stories that you enjoyed, or even just non-linear segments of stories that you enjoyed?
Yeah, the one that comes to mind immediately for me is, it's kind of a terrible film, but I really love it, is Swordfish. with John Travolta.
Oh
and
God, I remember that from like the 90s.
and
Yeah.
it would be late. It would be early 2000s, maybe very
Okay.
late 90s.
Okay.
John Travolta. No, I think it was 90s actually, because I remember renting it from the video store. So, who else? It's got Hugh Jackman and
Halle
what was her
Berry.
name? She was Halle Berry.
Yeah.
Yeah. And basically, at the beginning of it, you just see this bank heist go off and everything blows up, and then it's kind of like, well, how did we get here? And I just remember seeing that and being like, wow, that's a really cool way to begin a movie. I actually want to see it again. I kind of love that movie, but it is objectively awful.
Really, really cheesy. Oh, Vin Diesel is in that as well. Yeah.
I think he is, yeah.
Oh, sorry, not Vin Diesel. Vinnie Jones, the footballer,
Oh,
English footballer. Yeah, I don't, he might not be very big.
Maybe, don't know him.
Big over here.
I've not heard of this movie. I have no idea.
Oh, it's real cheesy.
It's really cheesy. Just John Travolta's hair alone is just it brings the cheese factor up. Like, but yeah, it's great though. I really enjoy it.
Yeah. It's been that Hollywood was really into like the dual wielding pistols era.
Yeah.
Did they ever leave that era?
I haven't seen a dual wielding pistol.
True. You know what? You know what? True. You know what?
Yeah.
True.
Yeah, but that's got a that begins like right at the beginning, and then we kind of go back, and then it actually goes further than that. So it's like the midpoint of the film, which feels like quite a common thing to do. It's the midpoint of the narrative, and then it passes that, and
So the first one I'm going to talk about, I'm actually going to talk about the book I'm writing right now, because now it's like a bit of a separation here, because my book follows the 3-act structure, but the timeline is all over the place, in the sense that Act 1, the like setting the stage, building pressure, you start at a point and then you jump, and then you actually tell the story backwards from that point. So you're actually telling it back to a midpoint as the person's making their journey, but you're following their journey backwards. So you first see them at the destination, and then the next time you see them, they're actually at the kind of the last step leading up to the destination. And that's the entire first act of the book. And then once you get to the midpoint, we jump back up to where the book started. Right. And it's at that initial event that the big kind of thing kicks off. So you're following the journey backwards. That's setting the context. You jump back up to that initial event where you started, and you're at your middle point where the big kind of moment happens. And then after that, you drop way back into the past. Because then you need more. After that, it's like the world everything kind of changes, and then you need more context. So it's like, let's see what happened there. You alter between, you jump to some new characters and also mix in some stuff from the past. But it's that first act that I really like the structure. And it's also, I like it because this isn't me forcing a structure that's like, wouldn't it be cool if I did a structure like this, so edgy, so hip. This is the way the story wanted to be told, and it's like, whatever. Like, I'm following it because it's how it wanted to go. But it's a wild structure, but it's fun. It's a lot of fun.
Love that. Okay. Love
Yeah,
that.
very cool.
I'm kind of seeing if something like that will work in a story I'm working on at the moment myself, where the supporting character's story will happen in real time and follow the 3-act structure. The characters go into a dangerous place, things get bad. At the midpoint, there's a big disaster, things get even harder, and then they reach the kind of climactic moment. But the main character's storyline takes place between the midpoint and the end of the story, but how it starts running in parallel from the beginning. But I'm waiting to see if everything lines up the way I'd like it to, because I want to make sure that the pacing of one doesn't impact the pacing of the other. And I may end up having to move it all into a chronological story if that is the issue. But at the moment, I'm seeing how that plays out, simply because I want to spend more time during that period where things are really bad, but I need the structure of the story can't be too bloated in that section. So I'm going to see if this other system will work for it. A story that I really love that uses the non-linear way of telling kind of the events of the story is another one by Dan Simmons called The Terror, which is about a pair of boats that these have probably heard me talk about this one before. There's a pair of boats that get landlocked in ice while they're trying to pass from England through to the bottom of India, through the Northern Passage. The water all freezes around the boats and the boats get stuck. And they get stuck there
Yes.
for 2 years. Yeah.
Oh, 2 years far out. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay.
Yeah.
Keep
Yeah.
going.
Like it doesn't thaw enough during the summer for them to move at all.
Wow.
So the first chapter of the book takes place when they've been there for 2 years, and then the next chapter is them preparing to go on the voyage.
Oh my
So in the sense
gosh.
of like setting up a disaster, in that sense,
Wow.
that chapter where they're setting up what they're doing, they're able to put in all the information about how unprepared they are, how they don't have enough food, all the stuff that could go wrong, and then it's like that will be fine, and it goes back to naming the ice. And
Wow.
it's a great way of telling it because it jumps right to the most interesting part of the story when they've
Yeah.
been stuck and they're starting to put together that there's like polar bears hunting around the outside of the ship, and then it
Oh,
gets to
man.
go back and explain the voyage and explain how they got stuck. So that's way of telling that first act works really, really well.
That I
Really good.
love that.
Yeah.
This is I do remember you talking about this one where it's like the psychological horror playing off of the polar bears hunting outside that are kind of it's this creeping tension that's
Yes. It's
yes.
also the polar bears do also. It's also like the physical horror of the polar
Also the
bears.
physical threat of a polar
Yeah.
bear.
And you
Okay.
don't know if it's actually a polar bear, do you? Like it's potentially
That's
a
it, yeah.
supernatural
Yeah,
thing,
it's-
right? It's
yeah.
really hard to
Because
be.
it's like something that like the characters are also stuck in that position like that an animal would be, where they can't see it
Yeah.
until it gets close because of the
Mhm.
fog and because of the wind and because of the almost perpetual
Ugh.
night. So they really don't know what's like obviously
Yeah,
sailors
that's-
start to become more and more paranoid and come up with more and more things that it could be,
That's freaky.
Yeah.
and they're also suffering from like malnutrition and scurvy and stuff, everything like that. Yeah,
Brutal.
I didn't
great
realize
book, great book.
I didn't realize they were stuck there for 2 years. That's
Yeah, and
hectic.
it's based on a true story.
No.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Jeez.
The book, I think the boat was called the Terror. Yeah,
Oh really?
Oh,
That's ironic.
so this is a bad name.
why? Okay.
That's an
fine.
omen. Yeah, why would you do that?
I
Yeah,
don't know.
bad luck.
Have either of you guys seen Baccano?
Baccano?
It's an anime.
Oh no.
Okay. This one does a really interesting plot structure where they have two parallel plot lines, and the main sort of like when people think Baccano, they think, oh, there's like a train. The main setting is a train. Like it all takes place on a train and there's a murder going on. There's like so
Nice.
it's got that nice tension where it's like a closed space, killings are happening. There's also there's a few it's a really good show. I highly recommend it. Baccano, great anime, as well as it's not like super long. It's one season. It's really satisfying start to finish. But the thing that's really interesting about it is the main setting of the show takes place on this train. And like the opening the first episode is everyone kind of they're introducing everything and everything's kind of shaping, and then second episode you're on the train proper, you're exploring the train and stuff. But the train, and then periodically you're kind of flashing to this other plot line that's taking place, which is actually in the past before anyone actually goes onto this train. So you have this parallel plot line in the past that's actually giving context to things that are happening on the train that you're periodically going back to.
Yeah.
So these two parallel plot lines that are feeding off of each other. But the principal plot line is actually in the future that you're kind of jumping back to every now and then. So it's this really weird, it's pretty interesting because it's kind of like what you said with the example you gave, James, where it's like you give the first chapter where they're in the situation and it makes all the preparation all the more ironic and stuff. In this show, you don't really know, like you know that there's some tension going down in the train, but seeing as it's an entire plot line that's going on in this train, it's like it's not the same sense of irony as in like because you don't really know what's going to happen, so you don't know what's really ironic about it, you don't know what it's building to. All you know is like so this plot line takes place before they're on the train, so they're not even aware of each other yet, or they're it's a really interesting unfolding. Great show, really, like it jumps around a lot but manages to not be disorienting, which is really cool. It does it very well.
Nice. Okay, that sounds pretty cool.
The
Mhm.
yeah. The That's what is it? Baccano, Bakino?
I think it's Bakano.
Baccano.
I
Okay,
don't know.
all right.
With an exclamation
Good.
point, I
Always
think as
looking for
well.
quality anime.
It's a little bit
Um,
older too, so it's got some soul to it, or like
oh
some
yeah,
old, not
got
too old,
that
but
like
old.
90s anime flair to it.
Hmm.
The real pointy chins and things.
Not quite that, but I
Okay.
know exactly what
All
you
right.
mean.
Um, the one I feel like we're just listing them at this point, but I'll give you at
Yeah,
least one
just
more.
fly.
One I read recently by a guy called John Darnielle, who's actually the lead singer of a band called the Mountain Goats. Have you guys heard that? Really
Oh
great
yeah.
band, really good. I've seen them live; they're incredible. He wrote a book called. He's actually pretty prolific. I think he's got 3 or 4 books now. But his first one was this thing called Wolf in White Van,
Oh,
and what it
he
is
wrote
it
that.
tells you, yeah.
Oh,
What? Yeah, I know. That's so weird when you like connect those dots. It's wild.
wow.
But that book is about, and I'm sure I've mentioned it before, is basically about a a um a disabled person, and they don't really specify exactly in what way he's disabled. I think at least for most of the book, but
Yeah.
he's quite disfigured and finds it difficult to move and breathe and eat properly, so he has a carer. Basically, it starts at the end of this tragedy where these kids have died as a direct result of something he's done. And you don't find out exactly what it is, but you just have this feeling, this weight of crushing guilt that, like, I have directly or indirectly, really, as you find out, been responsible for the deaths of these 2 children. And then it works back from that point until it gets, until the last page is basically. I think it actually does describe it because he's not there for the event, but it does describe him getting the note and then him basically just being like, "Wow, this is my life. This is what kind of happens." I think there's a little bit of an epilogue sort of thing there, but yeah, essentially it's this ticking clock that's going backwards until this horrible events happened, and there are other events and things that occur within it as well. But it's really haunting and a really interesting way to structure a book. I've got to read it again, actually. Really, really enjoyed it.
I listened to that one. The
Mm,
audio performance is phenomenal as well.
really?
The voice actor, like it's weird to imagine that book in not that person's voice.
Right.
I feel like he just suited it so well. Um, that book does some really cool stuff because you have the fact that he's disabled. You don't know in what way or how it happened
Yeah.
for most of the book. And you know that there was an accident that was clearly a big deal. And you don't really know much detail about that either for a bit of the book.
Mm,
So you have these two events that are kind of swimming and
yeah.
they're related in some way, but you actually don't know a lot about them. And it's interesting because so there's actually quite a lot of nonlinear structure there because you're
Yeah.
building up to you actually have two storylines that have terminal points, but one story comes before the other one, but you're telling them simultaneously because
Yep.
when he eventually has his accident, that's what leads to the events of him causing this other accident inadvertently.
Mm, yeah.
But at the same time, post-accident is the beef of the story. That's where you spend most of your
Mm,
time. But at the same
yeah. Yeah.
time, it's a wild, but it stays organized. It makes sense and has this really slow burn reveal feel that's very satisfying.
Yeah. It's very it's all it manages to wrap a lot of things into it. It's very like there's a sinisterness to it, but it's also really, really heartfelt.
Yeah.
And you feel really empathic for this person who's just like I just remember the one scene where he just goes into the DMV or whatever and sees his friend from high school and like the guy's just reaction to him and it's just like just being on the other side of that, if you like saw someone who you're like, oh my God, you've been horrifically disfigured, and like how that would play out is just like
Mm.
heartbreak. It's really, really intense.
Wow,
Yeah.
that sounds incredible.
I didn't realize that the guy from the Mountain Goats wrote that. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's crazy because like, you have a lot of famous people that write books and it's like a biography or something like that. So when you said he was a writer, he has 3 or 4 books, then you said that book, I was like, oh, he's a good
He's a
writer.
Yeah, he's like a writer, and you can kind of tell from his songs as well because they're all very like I don't want to say literary, but they're just good. They're good songs. He's got a great song called "Lovecraft in Brooklyn," which is just this like really tense, like wiry rocker. But like he's just got he wrote this year as well. Like they're just entire short stories within the space of a single song. Like yeah, really really phenomenal writer. I got to read more of his stuff actually. Yeah.
Nice. That brings me back to almost like kind of songs within songs, kind of like pacing. Another reason that the three act structure and the hero's journey works really well, because of pacing. And you can use the three act structure not just in the overall story, but in kind of chapter to chapter, little sections. I know Dan Simmons, if he's writing a long action kind of set piece, you'd actually see that his action set piece is laid out like in the hero's journey, where there's kind of a rising action that goes on throughout it, a rising tension and stuff that goes on throughout it, and different realizations. One book that I really enjoyed and then absolutely loved when I sat down and kind of like broke it down a little bit is Every Dead Thing by John Connolly, which is a detective story, which tends to have a fairly standardized way of setting it out. He's given the case, he investigates the case, he has a setback towards the end, and then he kind of usually solves the case. But in Every Dead Thing, the main character is a private detective, and he ends up investigating 3 separate cases that end up being connected throughout the runtime of the story. But the book is broken up into, from 1% to 100%, there is a hero's journey. But then from 1% to about 80%, there is another hero's journey. Sorry, not quite 1%, but maybe 5-10%. There's another hero's journey because one of the other cases follows this mapping. Then from the beginning of the book to the midpoint of the book is another hero's journey because that's the smaller
stories.
case. And then from the beginning of the first act to the midpoint is its own little isolated journey. So the pacing of that book is just incredible. There's always some new piece of intrigue which is being discovered.
Whoa.
But there's a constant sense of direction, constant ticking clocks and things closing in. Because he's broken it up, he's put in all these little pieces. There's like 4 running heroes' journeys going on throughout it.
And these are different events, right? And different with the same guy, but like different events. So it'll change to a different like time space or
it's
like
it all happens linearly from
oh wow,
from the first chapter to the second chapter. A year passes, but from that point on, everything happens. I think over the course of a matter of no more than a week. But he ends up investigating these things they're all kind of happening at the same time. And one piece of information in this case ends up relating back to that case.
Wow, that's crazy.
That's so cool.
Works really, really well. Yeah. Excellent book. Really good characters, really good plotting. And I think it's utilizing that, the hero's journey and the triac structure, which allows him to keep everything separate and keep everything moving, keep everything in conversation with each other as the story goes on. But that's a great way of keeping the pace working in your story. If you're finding you're having a difficult time dealing with a chapter or dealing with a long sequence where you feel like it's a bit all over the place or it drags, take the triac structure, take the hero's journey and see if you can fit it into the chapter, and it'll make that chapter run quite smoothly.
True.
Make that section of the story really dynamic.
The thing I really like about non-linear structure or interesting structure things is it feels like it feels like the last frontier of experimentalism in fiction. Like, yes, you can play with language and do all sorts of things, but I find that you've got a limited amount of power that you can use to do that. Like once you do it more than sort of once, have one really trippy thing, it kind of loses its potency a little bit. So arranging things and putting things in these non-linear orders is really good. Another example of a book that I really enjoyed, and I don't actually read a lot of crime fiction, so this was quite. I don't like a lot of it. I'll read a lot of it and be like, It was traced by Catherine Jinks. The way she does that is it's like about it's about basically a stalker and someone who's like a domestic abuser, and it's told from the perspective of a mother, and the daughter gets into this relationship with him, and it kind of tells that story, but at the same time it tells the story of like years later when the mother comes into contact with this person again and finds that he is doing the same thing to someone else. So it does these two parallel lines where the first one's like the mum seeing this happen and she has a history of domestic abuse, so she knows the signs, and this daughter is just falling deeper and deeper into the trap of this guy. But then the second one is her like discovering, oh no, he's back on our radar, and he's like really smart and really able to like figure out who I am. So there's this rising action of like the daughter like basically getting bulldozed into this relationship, and like they're about to get married, and then she's like, I don't want to do this, you have to save me, and so they do that. But then the other one is about like the classic thriller thing of the killer like kind of coming to get the family in general, and it's done in a really, really clever way. And they both just run pretty much like from the beginning of the book through to each point, and they finish it almost the same time. Like the secondary plot, the one that's like set in the present, does kind of that finishes it up. Like so, the first plot is finished up a little bit before that, but yeah, basically they're told in parallel, similarly to how it is told, except with the time events are kind of squished together a little bit. Like there's not as far between each event, and that was a really engaging way to tell a story. I've seen that done quite a couple of times to pretty great effect. Shout out to Catherine Jinks, who we had on the podcast as well. But it is a very good book.
Snap! I didn't make that connection. That's amazing.
Yeah. I was trying to remember where I remember the name from. Yeah.
Oh man, what was the question you were going to ask before, James? Was it about pacing?
Yeah, I was going to ask if anyone had come across anything similar in books that they'd read, where almost like a little, not quite a little story within a story, but something where like the structure was used to enhance the story. Not that the structure is used to enhance the story, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
where it inceptioned itself or something.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it is like I mentioned just before is a big one.
Yeah.
Like it's pretty much exactly what I just described, like two simultaneously events happening side by side, and I feel like that is the most basic version of like, hey, we're messing around with plot stuff. But that's because it's very effective. Like you've got two stories that are being sold simultaneously, and they just run along these parallel tracks. Maybe one finishes a bit sooner than the other, but it's a really effective way to be like, hey, here's what's going on now. But also there's this other story that's happening simultaneously that's in the past. That can be hard to do because you want to make sure that like so the story set in the past inherently has left gravity because you kind of know the outcome of it. Likely you may not. It's possible you could obscure that, and that would make it more tense. So you need to make sure that both those stories are really engaging, so that you don't go like, yeah, but get back to the real life stuff. Like get back to the that sort of thing there. But that's a very effective way to be like, hey, we're going to break this up into two things, and you can provide context and ideas that bleed from one into the other, and you can see someone do something in the past and then be like, oh, that's why they have that scar. There's very clever things you can do with regards to that.
Something else that I came across in another John Connolly book called The Reapers, which follows a pair of homosexual hitmen who are living together, who take obviously hit jobs and go around and take people out. They have something from their past come up. Someone they'd wronged in the past is coming after them, kind of thing. And probably the first 45% of the book is the first act, which feels a bit bulky, but it switches characters a bunch of times, and everything is kind of circling around these main characters, these two hitmen. So the story never leaves them behind, although it's from different characters' perspectives.
Okay.
And you have kind of the inciting incident, and the characters are trying to figure out what's going on. They get a lead. They initially think, we're not going to pursue that, so it's kind of a refusal. And then something happens that pushes them into the second act where they're like, right, now we have to take action. So the second act begins, and they're planning they're planning their attack. They're putting together their team. They're getting everything together, and the story's feeling like it's really building up steam, and you're getting really involved for like what you're expecting to be like a big action thriller shootout assault kind of thing. And then at the midpoint of the book, everything goes wrong for these guys, and things start to come apart really quickly. And then the story switches perspective to one of the minor characters that had appeared earlier on. And what the story had subtly done was it had actually laid in the beginning of a hero's journey for this character. So this character ends up playing a huge role in the second half of the book, and what they're doing directly is affecting what's going on with the characters. So it manages to put you completely on the back foot for like the main plot line, and you're just watching these characters try to get their story's going in a completely different direction than you expected.
Wow.
And you're following this other character who is essentially just a civilian. So he is a normal person in this world of crime and killers and people who deal in debt. So he works as a great contrast. His ability to deal with things and his shock and his real reactions, or his kind of more normal reactions to all this stuff, is putting into contrast just how removed these guys are. So it works so well, and he manages to hide that by having it be multiple other characters in the first part of the story. So this second plot line is hidden and buried really well.
Is that like, does that kind of, obviously comes out of nowhere, but do you feel kind of gypped, like being like, oh, I thought it was about these things, and now I have to like, or have they set it up in such, I mean, it sounds like it's very, very well done, but is it set up in such a way that you're like, it just comes out of nowhere and you're like, oh wow, I didn't expect it to go this way, but like in a satisfying way?
A little bit of both, because I remember I read it before, loved it, sat down to read it again, and I think I read it in about 3 days. Like I couldn't put it down. You do have a little bit of a sense of, yes, I wanted to see them go in all guns blazing and tear this place apart, but there wouldn't really have been a story in that sense.
Sure.
Yep. It does. It makes a promise and it delivers on its promise. It just doesn't deliver on its promise in the way you expected. It makes for a far more interesting story that these guys, they hit such an obstacle, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Sure. If they had kind of come in like ninjas and tactically taken the place out, the story would have ended. So just the fact that, it wasn't as going to be as simple as they thought it would be, and now they're on the back foot trying to survive, makes for a far more interesting story.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think thematically, an awful lot of the stuff that's set up in the first half, which is like it's about these guys as killers, a lot of that is significantly more emphasized in the second part of the story by the fact that you have this normal guy now facing death and how he's responding compared to how they're responding. I think that works really well.
Yeah, what would you say? Because I'm just thinking of like if you had to distill the idea of breaking up the so there are two halves to this. There's the structure of the story, which is the hero's journey, and then there's the timeline of the story, which is the order in which the I guess story is given. And like I said, for mine, it's like the order is all over the place, but it follows the same structure. Like it's just given the way I follow that structure is just, it's not a linear story. So I guess talking purely about the timeline, like structuring and the delivery of like when you choose to give certain pieces of the story, I guess what advantages can you see to telling something out of order? That's just what I'm thinking of right now to sort of distill it down into that. The one that comes to mind for me is like, it is to give a piece. It can be seen as anticlimactic to give a piece of the future before jumping into the meat of the story, but at the same time, it also serves as it's a really good way to set tension, and it's a really good way, you could very effectively set tension, which is a bit counterintuitive because you'd think it would diffuse a lot of the tension. But it's also a really good way to set the tone, because if, like in your book, James, like you were saying, or the one story about people getting trapped in ice, the fact that they start with that chapter sets the tone of the entire book. Even though they're happy-go-lucky, setting up like nothing could go wrong, it's underpinned by this tone of, what's going wrong, where this is headed. And the inevitability of where they're going is an incredible
Inevitability was a big part of it, yeah. And I
Yeah.
guess the sense that when it's a horror story, I guess when you watch them making the preparations, knowing that they haven't made preparations to be stuck there for 2 years, knowing that they have preparations for like, oh, we'll be fine if we get stuck for 8 months, we have enough food, and it's like, you know that they're going to be there for like 3 or 4 times that amount of time.
That's chilling. No pun intended.
Yeah, and then as they're sailing, they realize that some of the food they have brought is contaminated and things like this. So
no,
the information that they're getting in the past directly impacts what they're facing in the present. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In the past, they cite polar bears, and someone is talking about the polar bears and various aspects of polar bear behavior, and it's all just interesting. The characters aren't taking it as very serious. But 2 years from now, there's going to be a polar bear clawing through the outside of the boat. So it becomes very relevant. So that way of delivering that information was that the information was delivered in an innocuous way, but it's going to have massive consequences later on, which horror stories often try to do. But they can be a bit obvious because they have to point to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas that way of doing it made it seem a little bit more, not that it's subtle, it's just it's blended in a different way, if you know what I mean.
It's so wild. Yeah.
Definitely with the non-linear stuff, there's a couple of like immediate benefits. Like you can, like Alex, you were saying, you can kind of say like you go back in past and you can have a character have an event and then they're like, well, that's why they're behaving this way, or that's why they have this scar or something.
Yeah.
And there's various ways that you can tell something that's going to happen in the future, and then that can create a sense of intrigue or a sense of excitement. Those are kind of the immediate payoffs, but I don't really think you should rely on just those. If you're going to do it, you should try to have it set up in such a way that the information recontextualizes in some way either what's going on now or what has already happened. If you're telling stuff in the future, it should recontextualize what's happening now. And if you're telling stuff in the past, that information in the past should seem innocuous to the characters then, but then become very important later on. I recently finished a short story where an event happens in the first act, and then the narrative skips over that event. I lead into it, and then I just skip right over it. The story moves on. And then about the middle of the second act, the character then tells the story of what happened. And then later on, he tells the story again, but he tells 2 different versions of the story. So the 2 different ways that those are presented are partly used to like fill in information, which is now relevant, give information in an innocuous way that'll be relevant later on, but also to recontextualize what's already happened and what's about to happen. Because if I'd had the events happen at the beginning, if I just had it happen, it wouldn't have been as interesting. So having the events happen or come back up when it's more interesting, because it recontextualizes what's going on now. And it also allowed me to have the character tell the stories in different ways.
And did that involve like an unreliable narrator? Like, because when he tells it the first time, he's like lying a bit? Okay.
Yeah.
That's
and
cool.
Generally, his perspective is kind of an unreliable narrator.
Okay. Yeah, right. That's always a fun tool.
Yeah. But in terms of comparing the non-linear thing to what I was talking about, like the triac structure within the triac structure, that's I think a pacing thing which can help structure. It works for as an overall structure, but also works as well as a small structure within the story.
Yeah.
And like I was talking about with the second story, The Reapers, where he kind of had the 2 plot lines, I think that was more a subversion. So you kind of had a sense of where the story was going because of the first hero's journey. You kind of had a sense of the pacing and where things were going, and you knew what was going to happen. And then he had this second character story become more relevant. So it threw you off and made you feel like, well, now I don't really know what's going on. So it became less of a predictable story, which I thought worked really well for that story. So you can use the structure to enhance by following it, or you can use it to kind of subvert and change things around. Like you were saying, Alex, where the kind of the new frontier of storytelling, you can be experimental by having it say, here's your triac structure, and you know what's happening, and then it's like, nope, it's actually this.
Yeah,
multiple
the
other
bottom
characters
just falls away halfway through it. I'm trying to think if I've ever used any any real. I've always wanted to do some like plot linearity subversion. Like there's a little bit in the first book I read, but really that's just a flashback, and that's not really the same thing. Yeah, but I mean, certainly, yeah. I don't think I ever have. It's always something I've wanted to do, but I'm just like, I don't know if I've been able to fit the story around it. I'll admit, like plot structuring is probably my weakest point as a writer, I think. But it is definitely something I'd like to experiment with.
Something I definitely struggle with as well. I probably use the non-linear thing because it makes me feel like I'm being a little bit more loose and a bit more experimental.
Yeah.
But then as I'm doing it, I kind of have to decide, does it need to be this way? Or would it be better if it was a bit more straightforward?
Yeah, you'd almost have to write both stories out in like postcards or something the way Ali does, and then
sit back and look at them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could try doing them one at a time and just write the story one of them. But like, if one of those parts hits a dead end, then like it might have a domino effect on the rest of it. So I'd be pretty scared to do that. It'd be fun, but
just to call out, like if you're thinking of writing a story, like we've said before, like just make sure that it actually serves the story as well as it serves the story to be told in a non-linear way or in some way that subverts the structure. Make sure it serves the story, but also make sure sometimes it can be hard to, like, you read a story that's structured in a particular way and it feels really cool, the reveal is really cool, the tension is great, and you're really attracted to that. So then people try to do it to mirror that. But in reality, they're just kind of mirroring this, like they're kind of creating, it's kind of mechanical. They're doing it out of order, but it doesn't necessarily serve the story, or they don't necessarily understand plot structure enough to actually subvert plot structure. Because in reality, you can jumble up your chapters all you want. You can put parts before other parts, but the tension might fall out. Like things might not make sense, or it might just make no sense at all. Like for instance, if you did want to throw stuff jump into the future, then jump back to the past, how do you avoid not diffusing all of your tension by putting something in the future at the front? And in the end, the reason that, like, I keep using your example of the ice story just because I don't know why it's relevant. But like, if you have the first chapter, the reason the first chapter works in that book, even though it's in the future and giving you information about what's going to happen and why it builds tension as opposed to diffusing tension, is because the story isn't about how they got stuck in the ice. The story is about if they're going to survive and what happens. So by showing that, it hooks. It doesn't diffuse tension, and then everything after that jumps back into the past becomes ironic. And like James said, it recontextualizes and makes everything like tragically ironic. But again, it's not about, if the story was about how, like, if they're going to get stuck in the ice or not, then you've diffused all your tension. You already know where it's going. So you've already divulged your climax. So you can jump into the future, but make sure it doesn't divulge your climax. And like
Hello, Phoenix here, momentarily interrupting myself. You're about to hear me give another example of a story with a non-linear plot. I say 50 Shades of Grey, but what I really meant to say was 500 Days of Summer. So, yeah.
Like one other example is 50 Shades of Grey. That jumps back and forth between the past and the future all the time. It's a rom-com it's a really good one. But up front, and that's a great example of where it's used to set tone, because the story from the onset, one of the first lines is like, this is a story of boy meets girl, but this is not a love story. So it's like, oh, you already know you're subverting expectations, and then they jump to like way far into their relationship where they've already broken up. From the onset it doesn't work out. There's hard feelings, it's nasty, all this stuff, and then you jump back to the rose-tinted glasses and find out how they met and all this stuff, and it's fun. You jump back and forth between these two timelines because they're not telling the story of, if from the onset they're not going to get together. So the future can be used to set tone, and you're not giving away anything by jumping into the future because you already know that happens. So then the future becomes a tool to tell the real story that's being told, which is their human personal growth, which does involve both timelines.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of one more, a really subtle way of doing this. It's really subtle, and so subtle I hadn't realized it's doing it until I sort of thought of it in this way. So there's a book called Daisy Jones and the Six, which is really good. It's a
Great
biopic. Book. Yeah, really good.
Right.
I listened to it as audiobook, which I think almost might have been the ideal way to do it because the performances are amazing.
Yep.
But what that does is it's a music biopic about a band that's kind of based on Fleetwood Mac. Like there's just a lot of the band members are all like in relationships together and it's all coming apart and stuff. But the way that does it is it tells it linearly. However, it is being told linearly by people way in the future. Like they're looking back on their life and talking about this. So at the very least, these people survive. But also you get these little glimpses of like, well, this is how this is going to go. Like, I can't think of any particular examples, but particularly when they're talking about their love interests and things, you can literally hear in terms of the audiobook, but you can read that there's this sense of like longing or nostalgia. So you get a sense of, well, maybe this isn't going to work out, but it's a very, very subtle way of doing that. And that's, that interview style thing is very rare. I haven't seen it done a lot, but very, very effective in that book. So that's a nice subtle way of doing it. Yeah.
And just something to add on to your point, Phoenix, about the structure servicing the story. They did turn The Terror into a TV series, but they told it linearly. And I think it totally doesn't work. It completely jams up the pacing. They have to introduce certain characters at the beginning who don't become relevant for a very long time. They have to introduce all this information because it'll be important later, but it ruins the pacing altogether for the story.
True.
Yeah.
It's a novella, isn't it, James?
Yes. Yeah. Quite a long one, so it's a good one to pick up. I highly recommend it. If you like Dan Simmons' writing, Phoenix, I'd highly recommend it.
I will check it out. Do you know if it's an audiobook? I've been looking for a good audiobook.
It's a good long audiobook. Yeah, it's a good one. That's how I listen to it. Yeah.
It's it's called The Terror.
The Terror, yeah.
The Terror. Ooh.
I listened to Hyperion on actually Hyperion is another one that's that is from that same perspective. It's I mean, I'll be quick because we've given hundreds of examples, but basically it's about these six characters. I think it's six.
It's
7,
6 to 7. Yeah,
it might. Yeah, it's 6 or 7. Anyway, they're traveling to. I believe.
Also, be careful because I'm currently reading this. So
Phoenix
there's no spoilers in it.
It's on my list actually of ones I wanted to bring up though.
Yeah, they're all basically going to this planet to get this wish fulfilled. I believe it's based on the Canterbury Tales. I did read that somewhere. All the characters are based on those. There's like the soldier and the monk, and but basically they're all telling the story of their life of how they got to this point. And then that kind of plays out. The actual story plays out, but really the book is about their background and telling that story.
Yeah, and their background adds context to like the greater worlds and what's going on. So that one worked really well.
Yeah, exactly. But
it's really cool. Series of short stories that contribute to one long arc, basically.
Yeah, that's a fun way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, really good.
But satisfyingly, it does not feel disjointed at all. It does. It feel everything fits. I don't feel like I'm reading like
filler.
I don't feel like I'm reading filler, and I don't feel like I'm reading a collection of short stories. I feel like I'm reading one work because it is like each of these stories have their own individual arc, and they're fully different stories, like tone, style, like everything that's going on. So different. It's wild. But they do all contribute. They are all setting context to this world, and they do proceed to add to affect the tone of the larger journey at hand. So they do. I guess that's why they feed very nicely into each other.
I found myself reading it to get to the next character story because I wanted to figure out like, who are you? What's your background?
Yeah.
Really engaging.
Who's your favorite character, James?
Saul. think was his name.
Oh, which
The
one?
scholar.
Saul. Ah, yeah.
Yeah.
Saul's cool.
Definitely, yeah.
Whenever the drunk, the like poet guy,
Yeah, he's so good.
Yeah.
anytime every time he's in my mind, I see him as not Littlefinger, the other guy, the spider from Game of
Oh,
Thrones.
really?
That's how he
interesting.
looks in my head every time. I'm like,
Varys,
oh,
yeah.
what are you
Do you
doing
have a
here?
favorite, Alex?
I like, yeah, the poet is my favorite.
Yeah.
He's just so wild and like, you know, his story is just so interesting. Like, it's just
Yeah.
it's been a while since I've read it, so that the details are a bit hazy. But yeah, he was. I found myself going like, when are they going to get to him? I want to hear his story. and it was really good.
I haven't gotten.
But
to his
they're all
story
really
yet.
interesting stories. Like the one at the beginning with the monk is just.
Oh my
terrifying.
gosh!
Yeah.
With the
Whoa.
pygmies and stuff. It's whoa.
Yeah.
Wild. That
Yeah.
was. Oh my gosh! If you don't want to
Yeah.
read the whole Hyperion book, you could read
Just
just
read-
that.
yeah,
just read
the
that
first
first
one.
story.
Yeah.
That was
It's
such. That was such an
insane.
excellent story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
Really good.
Oh my gosh, the tension.
I thought
on
they would
that.
all be like that. So when I got to the second story, it was totally different. I was like,
Mhm.
okay,
Yeah.
this is something else. This is quite a book. Yeah.
That first story was like borderline Lovecraftian, like very
Yeah.
like very
Serious.
Lovecraftian actually, very like existential, deep old things, like really ridiculous suspense.
Yeah. Such
Mm.
dread for like a really long time.
Such
Dread.
dread.
Yeah.
You kind of know where it's going,
Yeah.
but it's like, how does it get there? Oh,
Yeah.
But that, you've hit on something as well, and we've talked about this. Like the telling someone the ending does not necessarily dispel the tension. Not necessarily, because
Yeah.
as the nature of reading a book or listening to a book, if that's your preferred medium, is that we're along for the journey. We want to know how it happened. We want to know how we got there. So, like, if you like, I've always thought a great way to start a book would be like, let me tell you how I died, and then have that be the story, or at least a portion of the story. You know, because you're like, especially if you're not giving any context for, because they're telling you how, you know, that they're dead. But you don't know in what state they exist, and you don't know how they got there. So it's a hook. It's like it's, even if, you know, especially if that was like not quite the end of the story. You know, it's yeah. So revealing a piece of information, as you said when you were talking about the Terror James, does not inherently dispel the tension of the story. Sometimes it can be the opposite. It could be a hook, a very powerful hook.
I think Lovecraft does that quite well. He might tell you at the beginning of the story that a character is dead, but then the story isn't based on whether or not they survived. The story is based on how did it eventually happen.
Let me
he'll also do a
tell you
great
how I came
job
to
in-
ruin.
Hey?
Let me tell you how I came to ruin.
Yeah, or if someone ends up in like a mental institution or something, and you're like, "Oh God, what happened to them?" You know, kind of thing.
Yeah. I'm playing a video game right now called Darkest Dungeon, which is basically, you would love it, James. You would just love it so much. Like, it
I
is
think I've
right
heard
up
of
your
this.
alley.
Is this the one where you take like a party into the dungeon and your characters
yeah,
can
and
go
then-
insane? Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. And then
Yeah.
you have to deal with them being insane and what that
developing
means.
PTSD and stuff like this.
Yep,
Take
100%.
them
And it's
to
really
the-
annoying when that happens.
Take them to the bar. Yeah,
Yeah. You got to take them to sanitarium and, like, you know,
the
have to have them,
darkest
like,
kind of team management.
Yeah, it is. It really is. It's so much fun though. But like the way that story is told is that there's this narrator who's like he actually narrated Lovecraftian books, and he talks like this, and like he's got all these things like the greatest blade cuts on its own when someone gets like poisoned. It's really good. The way that gets told is as you go through these boss battles, because every now and then you'll have a boss one. It'll tell you this little snippet, and there's like 3 to each of them, and like each time it gets further and further along. So the more you play it, the more you realize how much of this game is like, how much of what's happened to you now is directly the result of this ancestor, this narrator, and like he just becomes a bigger and bigger jerk like the more you play, and it's just it's very chilling. It's also very funny in some ways, but yeah, so that's an interesting way of doing it. Just eking out this little bit, like as you're like from the past as you're going through. It's again that sort of linear, that parallel storytelling is very powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that might be time. Does somebody want to read out the quote?
Sure, I'll do it.
Cool.
Okay, so the quote: I believe in stories that are non-linear, as we are, hopefully. And that's by Natasha Sarkos.
Lovely.
And there you have it. I too believe in stories that are nonlinear.
And I believe in non-linear people.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much, listeners. And be sure to check out the new Mythic audiobook, which will be dropping on March 7th. I'm not sure when this episode will air, maybe before or after, but definitely be sure to pick it up. We're really, really delighted with how it turned out. 6 incredible stories, 6 incredible writers, narrated by 6 incredible voice actors. So yeah, definitely check it out.
Performances are great. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we were very excited that Dreamscape picked it up. So thanks, shout out to Dreamscape for distributing and handling all that. That's excellent.
Thanks,
very
guys.
exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another shout out if you're in California, early April 4th, and especially if you're into editing and some of the more technical craft of literature and stuff like that, as well as there are so many people going to, so it's the ACES Society of Editing conference in San Diego. They have heaps of editors from a bunch of universities, from like the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. and stuff like that, like people that are heavily involved in all sorts of different facets of writing and use it day to day. Professionals that have been doing it for a very long time.
Cool.
Heaps of people. If you go, you're gonna learn a lot. You're gonna meet a lot of people in the industry. And I'll be there. So if you come, you can say hi. So yeah, that's in California. ACES Society of Editing Conference.
Cool.
Mm-hmm. I'm pumped.
Yeah, it's gonna be awesome. I think that's it.
That's it. Then we just say that. We just say we.
The music will be playing over this.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
You're listening to Prose and Cons, the Precipice Fiction podcast.